In this section, we're going to be covering more detail on Cinecamera and post-processing volumes.
Okay, so I wanted to take a couple minutes and talk about the camera itself, just thinking about the camera. So one of the things that we want to be able to do with the camera in Unreal is sort of affect it the way we would normally look at a camera in the real world. So as an example, I'm just using the scene that we had set up, and I'm going to look at one of the camera actors that I have that I've made the Cinecamera actor for here. And what I want to do is I want to start by looking at something really simple. So like how do we actually kind of manipulate and use this camera? So I am going to just start by showing you a couple of the things that we can do with this. So if I go down to the details panel of our camera, you're going to see there are a couple things. And right here at the very beginning, you'll see current camera settings. And there's a couple things again that you can do in here. Like if I wanted to actually have something moving in my scene, I could say enable look at tracking and then actually have an actor move around and have the camera track with me. I can do this a couple other things in here as well. So for example, the film back, I can change that to say, we'll go in here and as an example, I'll change it to the IMAX 70mm. And you can see that it changes the actual film back, so it's actually changing the way that the camera is ingesting that frame. Typically what we'll do is we'll go to either the 16:9 film or 16:9 digital film or 16:9 DSLR, depending on what your end goal is or your end result might be. And then the next thing that we have in here are sensor width, sensor height. Typically those are just sort of by default listed at what that might be for the that particular film back or aspect ratio that you're looking at. Scrolling down a little bit more, you'll see that I also have some things in here for lens settings. So I have a minimum focal length, maximum focal length, so I can actually change the settings on the lens. And then I also have the f-stop, and one of the things that I've done with the f-stop here is I've made the f-stop really a really small number, right? So I'll get into that in a minute, but you can adjust all of those things. And then here in the focus settings, we have the option to actually change where our focus is. And one of the great things about this is I can come in here under focus setting, click on the draw option, and then this actually shows me if I were to move back and forth, it'll show me where my focus plane is. So now you'll see that that little area right in the front is nice and crispy, which is pretty cool, so it gives me an opportunity to kind of figure that part out, like where I'm focusing. I can also do that to tracking, or I can actually disable the focus on that as well. So, and then also a couple other things in here that I can really start to explore. I have the current focal length. So on my current focal length, I can literally, it's almost like a little bit of a zoom, so I can zoom in and out. And then down here is the other one is the current aperture. So one of the things that I can do with this is if I decrease my aperture like crazy, or if I increase my aperture, you'll see what happens is a really small number on the aperture makes the aperture way wider. So you always think the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. Okay, the smaller the number, the bigger the hole. So a bigger hole almost gives you, or it does give you, a much more shallow depth of field. So you can really see that with that really small 0.1 aperture, that I'm getting a really, really, really small depth of field in there, right? So that focus area is really small. So that's kind of the key. So when we're thinking about our cameras, we want to be able to kind of utilize the Unreal camera in a similar way that we would to a real world camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this camera and I'm going to start over, and I want to show you how to set that up so that we can utilize all of these different elements, because right off the bat, if you don't have a couple settings in place, it won't actually work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this Cinecamera Actor 4, and we're going to start over and start looking at how we actually set all that up. And there's going to be a couple things that I'm going to kind of backtrack and talk about as we're doing this, because I've set a couple things in here as well that I needed to set to make it work, but I'll show you what we're going to do here in a second. So first thing is I'm going to find a shot I like, and again, actually kind of like this shot. And for this example, I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to just turn this fog density down quite a bit, like that, and zoom out of here. And I'm looking at this and I see that I have a crazy thing going on with this material in the background. So let me see if I can fix that, and I'll come back and tell you what's going on. So now let's go in and start creating what we were talking about here with creating that camera. So what I think I'm going to try to do is grab a shot that's maybe something like this, maybe kind of like that. I like that shot there. And again, I could turn that fog on or off as I'm going. I like it, but while I'm kind of working on my focus and some of the other things, I might want it to just be off, and then I could turn it back on later. So what we'll do is, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create that camera at that location. So I'm going to scroll around, find the shot I like, which again is sort of like that. Yeah, perfect. Go up to this little tab right here that says perspective. This is my viewport options, and I'm going to come down to create camera, create cinecamera actor, and now you'll see that it has created that camera there. And if I go in there and select it, now that is the camera that I'm looking through. Now be careful on this one, because if I were to move around, it's actually changing the position of the camera. So this is actually called piloting the camera, and that's the way it's designed to work. So if you want to not do that, you have to pop out of there and it'll go back to perspective. But in this instance, I actually want to be in there so I can see the full frame of what I'm doing. And now, remember we talked about this before, but in the individual cameras here, I can come down and start to look at some of those settings. So one of the very first things I want to do with this, though, is I'm going to scroll all the way down. Well, actually, I'll type it in here. I'm going to type in exposure, or just EXPO, and then the reason I'm doing this is because if you remember before, we turned off a setting in the project earlier that made the exposure actually automatically kind of like come up or down depending on like how bright the scene was. So we can do a similar thing here, but what we want to do is we actually want to set this to manual, because what we're going to do is we want to make sure that we're applying manual exposure to the camera. And then the other thing we need to do here is turn the apply physical camera properties, so that apply that exposure to the camera itself. So now what we should be able to do is we can go in and control things like the shutter speed and the aperture. Those will allow me to change the brightness of my shot. So as an example, let's go in and look at making this a little bit brighter now, because you can see it's very dark, right? Because what's happening is the camera currently is using the aperture that I have, the 2.8, and it's actually the scene just doesn't have enough light to kind of expose the shot. So if I were to try to bring that down a little bit, you see if I take the under the current aperture setting, if I bring that down to 1.2, see it brightens it up a little bit. If I take it up higher, it darkens it, right? So remember, the bigger the number, the smaller the hole. So what I'm trying to do here is I need to get an aperture setting, and I also can work on things like the shutter speed to adjust how bright the scene is. And at some point, just like with the real camera, you can only go so far. And at some point, you're going to have to just add more light to the scene, and that's totally fine. You just have to, kind of start to understand how the cameras work and how that functions within the world of cinematography inside of Unreal. So what I'm going to do, though, here is in my settings, what I want to do is I want to go into my lens settings, and right here it says max f-stop and min f-stop. See, it says 1.2. That's as low as it'll go. I don't need it to go higher, so I don't need to really change my max f-stop. Like 22 is pretty big there. But what I want to do is I want to type in 0.1 for the minimum f-stop. And then when I do that, now I can actually come in and take my current aperture all the way down to 0.1. And what you're going to see instantly is it makes the depth of field way more evident. And the reason it's doing that is because now at a way smaller aperture number, what it's doing is it's creating that very, very shallow depth of field. So now I can come in here and say, oh, cool, that actually looks pretty sweet. I like that. So what I want to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to just grab the manual focus here, and I can adjust it using this, or I can use this little eyedropper, click that and click on the car, and it'll instantly focus on that car, which is pretty awesome. So this looks pretty good. I kind of like that. I like what it's doing. And remember the other couple things that we talked about, which was the film back setting. This defaulted right now to the digital film, and the sensor width is fine. But then the other thing that I have in here is the focal distance is the thing that I want to look at adjusting, which is going to be under here. So you should see current focal length, and this is at 11.8 right now. So this sort of equates to, you know, if you were to like take that up really, really high, sort of like, kind of think of it like a zoom. You know, so I'm gonna put that somewhere around 25, I think. Oops, 25. And then what you're going to see here is when I set that to 25, now the camera, right? The camera is where it's at. So if I wanted to change that, I'd have to actually move the camera around, right? And by the way, we can animate the position of the camera, and we can animate all those things. Remember, you know, that's part of the charm of Unreal. We're not necessarily going to do all that right now, but I just want to kind of show you a couple of the things that we can do with this. So that looks pretty good. I like that. And then the last couple things I'm going to do, I'm going to scroll down quite a bit here, and I'm going to go under down here in some of the post-process areas, and I'm going to look for ISO. And I always have to search because everything's kind of all over the place here. But you see under post-process, lens, camera, ISO. If I click on the ISO setting and I increase the ISO, I'll also be able to adjust some of the exposure. Now, if you're familiar with an ISO, what happens with ISO is, like, you know, the higher the number, the more bright it's going to be. So it's like a faster film. Typically, we kind of max out with a real life camera, you know, somewhere around the 2800. Some go higher, but you can see you can go really crazy here in Unreal. You can go as high as you'd like, and it's just going to like constantly allow you to get a little bit more exposure there. So that's one thing. So I can adjust the exposure if I'm not happy with the ISO. And then the other thing that we could do is we could come in and look at the shutter speed. And this will do a similar thing. So let's say at 60 frames per second, that's the amount of light that I'm getting. If I drop that down to 30, you see it's getting a little bit brighter. 15, even more so. The thing is, though, if you drop it down to like something crazy like 8, if you were to say play the game or like make a cinematic, it's going to adjust, it's going to change the way it looks. So we typically want to stay around 30 or 60. So we're setting our camera up here in Unreal very similarly to the way we would in the real world, right? But we have to know there's a couple things that aren't going to work exactly the same. Like, until you get really, really into the lighting process in Unreal, the lights may not give off the same amount of illumination that like real world lights might do, right? Because the camera is not, you know, it's just not the same exactly. So what you'd have to do is kind of go back and forth and find the place where your exposure is looking good, the camera settings are what you want, so you can get the shots you want, while then going back and forth and saying like, well, this is a little too dark, this is a little too bright, whatever it might be. You just kind of play with that and go back and forth. So there's a couple other settings that you can look at too for that, which I'm going to come down here. All right, so the other setting that I was talking about here is what's called the exposure compensation. And right now, since we're using the metering mode as manual, there's this little checkbox right here which says exposure compensation. If I turn that on, you'll see it's set to 1 right now, which basically leaves it as is. But let's say I have my whole scene set up and I'm really happy with it and I like everything that's going on, but it's either a little hot or it's a little too dark. I can use this exposure compensation and start to dial that in appropriately. So I can make it a little bit brighter or a little bit less and just get it to the point where I'm really happy with that. So as an example, I'm going to show you a good use for this. So I'm going to turn that off. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this exponential height fog back on. And you can see right away, that's really kind of like that fog is really blowing out my scene. So what I could try to do is pop in, turn the exposure compensation on, and then dial that back a little bit until I'm happy with what that's doing. Now, as I said before, the other thing I might have to do is come into the exponential height fog and actually dial that density down, let's say to like 0.15, so that I'm getting the look that I want, right? Like this is all about the look, the feel. Again, as we're thinking about creating content or creating videos or creating cinematics, so much of what Unreal allows us to do is really craft the world that we're putting all this stuff into. It doesn't necessarily have to be the real world, but it should look the way you want or the way that you want to craft it. And there's so many other options for you to explore in here as well. I'm not going to get crazy into this, but there's a really great option here in the exponential height fog, which is the volumetric fog. If I turn that off, you'll see that it kind of like kills the soupiness of that fog. If I turn it on, you'll see that it really is starting to look kind of soupy and foggy. And one of the cool things that I'm doing in here as well is on my lights. So if I scroll down to my spotlight, I think it's this one. Yeah. On this spot, I'm hitting G, by the way. So, oops. I'm hitting G on the keyboard so I can see, that, and then turn it off because I don't really want to see the lines while I'm working on this. But the other thing that I can do here is on my light itself, I can actually add a little bit of what's called volumetric scattering intensity. So if I wanted to like take that down or bring that back up, right here, and I'll actually just get rid of that so you can see this. So in my light, in the details panel, you'll see I have all of my settings for this option. And then here is the volumetric scattering intensity. And if I bring that up to say 200, you'll see it's like actually showing that light. And the reason for that is because it's with the volumetric scattering intensity turned on the light, and then also on my height fog that I have in there. So let me just show you that one more time. In here, with the volumetric fog turned on. So volumetric fog on the height fog, and then the volumetric inscattering turned up pretty hefty. That will give you the ability to actually see kind of like light casting. So it's kind of cool. There's a lot of elemental ideas happening here, but again, it's just sort of like as we're diving into this, and you want to do more with the look and feel, this is a great way to do that. So dialing in the camera is a really, really important part of this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is something that you probably will be using quite a bit as you're moving forward with Unreal, and that is the post-process volume. And the reason I want to show that is because it's a great tool to use because it handles look and it handles design really well. So as an example, I'm going to go to the quick add button here, come down to visual effects, and just turn on a post-process volume. And then in my and you can see I have one in there already. I'm just going to delete that out of there. So you can see what happened. I turned the post-processing off, I deleted that one, and it changed the look of my shot. But in here, I'm going to select it, and there's a couple things I need to do with this. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here. It should be infinite extent unbound. You click on that, and now this will take effect over everything, not just what's inside the box. Now, if you don't want to use that, you can actually change the scale or the size of the box and then just make it just inside the box is what's being affected. But in this case, I'll just do unbound so that it shows everything. All right. And now in here, this is where we can get in here and we can really start to explore and play around. So I'm going to go in and look for color. And what I'm going to look for here is you can see there's all these different elements that I can start to color in here. But I'm going to use global here. And let's just say we'll grab saturation and contrast. And then in here, I can kind of come around and start to explore what these are going to do. You can see it's doing a little bit there. It's kicking a little bit more red into my scene. And then the contrast, let's kick that contrast up quite a bit as well. And kick my contrast over opposite of that, a little bit more green. These are just some of the small things that you can do. But there's a lot of great options that you can kind of play around with temperature, I can come in and play around with like the color temperature of my shot. I can also tint it a little bit if I wished, kind of like build that out. And if I don't like it, I simply turn it off. But I actually like that contrast quite a bit. So it's a great way to kind of build out a shot. And as you're learning more about your design process and your layout process in Unreal, playing around and exploring the camera really heavily will be really valuable. And then also the post-process volume. So the post-process volume actually will allow us to go in and set the exposure as well. So it's another way to utilize the exposure, the auto exposure or the manual exposure. You can use it in the post-process volume instead of on the camera, and there's a handy reason for that. So as an example, I'm going to go back into the Cinecamera actor, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the aperture, but I'm going to make sure my exposure is set to manual here. So pop that into manual. And you can see it's really, really dark, right? And by design, that's what's going to happen. But if I were to come in here and look at my aperture setting right there, so if I bring that aperture down or up in here, because I have that set to manual in the camera, this will adjust my exposure, which is cool, but also it makes it a little harder to like see what my depth of field is doing. So there's a way around that, and that's by using that post-process volume. Again, the post-processing volume is going to give you all those other options, as well as if I come in and look at the exposure, it gives you the ability to go back and forth between the auto exposure or the manual exposure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it on. I'm going to turn these guys on. Boom, boom. So auto exposure. And then also I have the exposure compensation. And if I turn that up or down, I can dial in where I want that to go. And we'll go back into the Cinecamera actor. So it's kind of a back and forth process. And then I'm going to go to the exposure here, and I'm just simply turn that off. And now what has happened is in the post-process volume, it's handling my exposure. So now if I were to go in here and adjust my aperture, you will see that my exposure doesn't change, but my aperture changes. And again, as I'm doing this, it's just a way to separate that out so that my camera isn't getting exposed differently by changing my aperture. Because in some instances, you don't want to do that. In some instances, you want the post-process volume to do all of that for me. Because again, if I go in here and look at exposure, and I set my post-process to expose and use exposure compensation, I can dial in the exposure that I want, and then go back to my camera and really dial that in as well with my focus distance, my aperture, and my shutter speed. And I would leave all the rest of that alone because I'm doing the exposure here. So post-process does quite a bit with that as well. And then there's also some really fun ones you can do. This is a bonus, but there's one thing in here called chromatic aberration. And what it does, it gives you this like really cool kind of visual effect. This is sort of an easy way to like make it look cool. But in Unreal now, this will all be animated. So if I were to say grab this car and have it zoom past, right? And obviously I would want the wheels to move and all that good stuff, but you get the idea. So it's a really cool way to design out and build out here right in Unreal. Use the camera to its full effect, and really, really build out examples of good cinematography in Unreal, because the more you can make it feel like a real world camera, the easier it is to translate from, let's say, the PreVis or the content development you're making into the real world. Or use Unreal to make the content. All right.